Hi, everybody. I am Hongju Park from Asan Medical Center, Seoul, Korea. So this time I'm going to talk about prediction of CI performance in postlingually deaf adults using machine learning technique. Let me start with the case of a 53-year-old man who had bilateral hearing loss. He had a right side sudden hearing loss 3 years ago, and then he got a left side sudden hearing loss 1 month ago. In audiogram, on the right side, it's totally deaf, and left side, the hearing threshold around 60 decibel, but the discrimination scores were pretty poor, 24%. And there was no benefit from the hearing aid in right ear, 0%, and left ear, only 20% of word recognition scores. He proceeded to the right side cochlear implant because that right hearing loss was started 3 years ago. And after 1 week of the cochlear implantation, his word recognition scores improved much from 0% to 76%. And after 2 years, the word recognition scores were 92%, which is a very successful result. This is the result. And then there are many people, postlingual deaf adults, who want to get a cochlear implant. However, not all of them have a very good post-operative result. For example, this man was a 53-year-old man. So the average post-CI word recognition scores would be about 60 or 70%. And there are a large individual variations. So you can say that generally the post-operative results are pretty good, but there are some exceptions. So it's pretty hard to tell the patient specifically the result would be good or poor. So we know the problem already, and there are lots of papers regarding the prediction of CI performance in postlingual deaf adults. So young age at CI operation was important, and short duration of hearing loss, which means duration of deafness, was also important, and the residual hearing is important. And previous hearing aid is better, and the absence of cochlear anomaly is also important. However, there was some different results regarding the duration of deafness. Most papers showed that the long duration of deafness have a poor post-operative result. However, a few studies did not show the negative result relationship. And regarding the age at CI operation was important. Most of them show that younger people could have a better result than the older people. But there's a few papers regarding there were no significant difference. So in this study, we wanted to analyze the prediction model because the previous studies only used the general linear model, and we want to have a prediction model using a machine learning technique, which is a non-linear random forest regression in this study. And we also further analyzed the changes of word recognition scores by predictive factors, which are duration of deafness and age CI and duration of hearing loss, hearing aid use. So this is the result, preoperative and postoperative result. And preoperatively, the best aided word recognition score were only 4.5%, and postoperative CI aided word recognition scores were 66%. So which is significant increase. And there's also a large individual variations. So when we see the results, the Pearson average improved from the 100, more than 100 decibel HL into the around 30 decibel HL. And regarding the world recognition scores, the most people show the increase of the world recognition scores. However, when you look at the result of about 12% show the post-operative world recognition scores less than 50%. Although the pre-operative result almost 0% in those people, but most people show the more than 50%, so it is not so successful. So we wanted to see what is the factors determining the post-operative result. And we use the random forest regression model. So these models are learning method for classification that operated by constructing a multitude of decision trees at training time and outputting the class. That's the mode of the class or mean prediction of the individual trees. We collaborate with Ho-Sung Kim from USC. And using the random forest model, we could have a very high prediction model. So for example, when you use a general linear model, the mean absolute error was 15%. However, when we use a random forest regression model, the mean absolute error was only 6%, which is a highly accurate prediction model. And we wanted to see which factors are important. So we omitted one factor and then run the regression model and then see the decrease of the prediction power, and then we can see that which factors are very important. So when we omit the duration of deafness, the increase of mean error, absolute error was the most highest, which is 15%. So we can say that duration of deafness is the most important factor for prediction of the post-operative CI result. So 3 important factors we could find. One is the duration of deafness and duration of hearing aid and AJCI. So those factors are which we already know about the prediction post-operative CI result. So we wanted to see the specific factors. So for example, duration of deafness, we reanalyze the data using the, by classifying the, in terms of the duration of deafness. So 1 to 4 years of duration of deafness, 5 to 9, and 10 to 19, and 20 years or more of duration of deafness. When you see the result, when the duration of deafness is more than 10 years, and then we see the decrease of the post-operative result. And then when we see the patient with the longer than 20 years, the lowest scores we could expect. So which means that, if the duration of deafness is less than 10 years, so we could expect a pretty good result. Although we also can expect a good result even though the patient have a more than 10 years of or more depth of duration. And this is the graph from the patient with the age of at CI operation at 40 to 59 years. So when you look at the data, when the duration of deafness is less than 20 years, you could expect pretty good post-operative result. However, the duration of deafness is more than 20 years, you can see some people have pretty poor result, especially when the duration of deafness is more than 30 years. The best, there are some people with pretty good result, but there are some people with the poor result. So, which in this case, we can say that the duration of deafness is pretty important. However, it's not always bad, even though the duration of deafness is more than 20 years. And regarding the HSCI, we saw the result. For example, we included patients with the duration of deafness less than 10 years, and we plot the data as a function of HSCI operation. So we could see that the younger people show the better result compared to the old people. However, when we see the patient with the depth duration of more than 10 years, the individual variation is pretty high. So it's pretty hard to tell the difference. But then there are some trends of the younger people have more better post-operative scores compared to the older people. And what about the hearing aid usage? When we classify the people who use the hearing aid for more than 5 years, we classify them as a good hearing aid user. Less than 2 years of hearing aid use was classified as a poor hearing aid users. And then you can see that when we see the patient with the depth duration of less than 10 years, this blue line show the result from the good hearing aid users. So they show the about 10% difference compared to the poor hearing aid users. And regarding the patient with the depth duration of 10 to 19 years, when the patient with the duration of deafness of 10 to 20 years, if they had used the hearing aid consistently, they have a pretty good result compared to the non-hearing aid users. So, which means that the hearing aid use is pretty important to get a successful hearing result. In summary, we adopted a machine learning model using the clinical data and to predict post-operative word recognition scores in post-lingually deaf adults. And our advanced model best predicted the outcome with a high accuracy of 95%. And short-term deafness, early CI operation, and long-term hearing aid use were key factors toward good CI outcomes. So our prediction models has the potential for predicting benefit from the CI and help the patient the counseling. And nextly, I'm going to talk about the hearing loss and dementia. So nowadays our society is aging, so there are lots of patients with dementia. So there are very much social concerns about the brain health nowadays. And the good thing is that hearing aid are a prevention against accelerated cognitive decline in later years. So as you can see that the dementia has a very shrinkage of the brain cortices. So this kind of brain problems can be induced by the hearing loss. So, and also that hearing loss is the most important preventable factors to prevent the dementia. So we want to see that the long-term hearing loss in postlingual deaf adults may lead to progressive structural changes in the cerebral cortices that process auditory and language functions. And these alterations may affect the outcomes of cochlear implant. So we aimed to predict CI outcomes by evaluating imaging features and quantifying cortical structural changes. So we studied 94 patients who underwent cochlear implant and 37 recent sudden sensorineural hearing loss patients who were expected to show no brain structural changes because that we get the image MRI from them within 2 weeks after onset of sudden hearing loss. So we performed a voxel-based morphometry to compare the brain gray matter probability, which is brain gray matter volume, between postlingually deaf adults and sudden hearing loss patient. We should know that the brain have various regions, and the auditory cortex lies on the superior temporal lobe here, and middle temporal lobe. The function of the middle temporal lobe is related to the learning of languages. So damage to these regions would impair the learning of languages. And we used this workflow for the prediction model. So we analyze the image data. And we use the coronal T1 weighted MRI image to do the voxel-based morphometry. And we compared the volume between sudden hearing loss versus postlingual deaf patient. And also we correlated the volume with the deaf duration. And these are results. So when we compare the brain volume between the control group versus postlingually deaf patient, the gray matter probability, which is a gray matter volume, show that of the postlingually deaf patient have lower gray matter probability in specific brain regions, including bilateral superior temporal cortex, which is the auditory cortex, and also middle and inferior temporal cortices. So these are important for the language learning and also the primary motor cortexes and somatosensory cortex here. So this is the superior temporal cortex, middle and inferior, and also these are sensory and motor cortices here. And also thalamus, there was a decrease of the cortical volumes. And what's the function of the middle temporal cortex, which is the middle temporal cortex is included in the ventral pathways, which is important for the lexical conceptual representation. And what about the, this small area? There was a decrease of the cortical volumes. And this area is specifically for the jaw and lips and tongues and throat and motor sensory areas. So which we can assume that because of the patient doesn't hear, they don't use their tongues because they have a social isolations and they have a less opportunity to communicate with other people. So that kind of activity we could see through the decrease of these motor and sensory cortexes. And we also wanted to see the changes of cortical volumes as a function of deaf duration. So when you see the middle temporal and postcentral cortices, as a function of depth of duration, the volume of the middle temporal lobe and postcentral cortices decreased, as we can assume that because we cannot hear, and then we do not need to understand the language. So this use of the middle temporal lobe, and result in the volume decrease. So we can assume that. However, interestingly, there was we could find a pretty decrease of the superior temporal cortex, which is the auditory cortex. So, however, the volume of the auditory cortex is decreased initially and for several years, several decades. However, after 30 years of deafness, and then the volume of the superior temporal cortices increased, which was not expected before we started this study. How can we explain that? So we assume that that kind of brain structural changes for decades comes from the cross-modal reorganization. So, for example, when a patient have a sudden hearing loss, and then the visual evoked potential was only represented on the occipital lobe. However, even after 3 months after hearing loss, the temporal cortexes responded to the visual stimuli, which means that the temporal cortex does not, normally does not respond to the visual stimuli. However, when the hearing loss occurred, and then only 3 months later, the temporal lobe was processing the information of the visual input. So we assume that long-term deafness, the temporal cortices, superior temporal cortices, auditory cortices might, might be involved in the visual pathways, and then, the volume can be normalized even after 30 years and even higher. So it was very interesting because that such kind of patient have a poor hearing aid users have a responding auditory cortices to the visual stimulation. So we can assume that in those people would have a poor postoperative CI result. So when we use the only images studies, we could expect the postoperative, we could predict the postoperative CI result, even using the MRI. And when we combine the MRI and clinical features, we could more accurate prediction result. So which cortices were important for prediction of the postoperative CI result? So there are a few cortices important. So superior temporal cortex was also important, and middle temporal cortex was also important. And the action was pretty different from each other. For example, middle temporal cortexes, when you have a larger middle temporal cortexes, and the end result will be pretty good. However, the lateral left superior temporal cortexes, if the volume of the lateral left superior temporal cortex is small, and then you could expect a pretty good result. However, the superior temporal cortex is too large, which means that represent the long-term duration of deafness, and then you could expect a more poor result. And this is a heat map. So you can see that there are lots of individual patterns show that poor and good outcomes could be explained not solely by a specific feature, but by a combination of multiple features. For example, this blue is a poor result, word recognition score, and yellow is a pretty good result. And then we can see that when we have a short duration of deafness, we could expect higher word recognition score here. And we also see that when the patient age at CI were young, we could expect a better result. So, and however, for example, here, superior temporal cortices, when we have a very large superior temporal cortex, which is the depth duration is pretty high, and then we could expect lower degree of word recognition scores. So, for example, here, so middle temporal cortex is volume is pretty high, which means that it's a recent one, here. So duration of deafness is very low, and also the age is age is pretty young, and then middle temporal cortex volume is pretty high, and then you can expect pretty good result. So in summary, the gray matter volume of the CI group decreased in various regions, including auditory and language areas, as well as thalamus and focal areas of other sensory and motor functional areas. So the auditory cortical volumes and thalamic volumes gradually increased from the initially reduced volume. So use of hearing aid may prevent the decrease of the auditory cortical volumes. And the middle temporal cortex, which is related to the language learning and thus understanding, gradually decreased as a function of deafness. But the left hemisphere middle temporal cortex was closely related to the post-CI word recognition scores. So we, in this case, so in this study, we analyzed the brain cortical changes by the deafness. So we could see the decreased volume of the multiple brain areas, which could be related to the dementia. And we should see the improvement of the cortical volume by the cochlear implant or hearing aid. And then we can see that the brain changes by the cochlear implant and hearing aid. And this kind of study would be helpful for the patient with the deafness who need a hearing aid or cochlear implant and also want to prevent the dementia. So this is what I prepared for you, and then thank you for your attention.